During World War II, the U.S. Army issued its soldiers an enormous amount of equipment. Some of it proved invaluable. Some of it earned its place through hard experience. And some of it quickly became the kind of gear soldiers looked for an excuse to leave behind. Before we get started, it is important to make one thing clear. This is not a list of items that every American soldier discarded. World War II was fought across deserts, mountains, jungles, hedgerows, frozen forests, and city streets. What made perfect sense for one unit might have been completely unnecessary for another. Commanders also had a say in what men could carry, modify, or abandon, so experiences often varied from one campaign to the next. But despite those differences, there were certain pieces of equipment that developed a reputation among American troops. Some were routinely abandoned before combat. Others were stripped down, modified, or quietly discarded whenever circumstances allowed. And although each item had its own story, most of them shared the same problem. When soldiers had to carry everything they needed on their backs, weight became the enemy. The longer the march and the harder the fight, the more valuable every pound became. Now let's count them down. Starting with number 10, gas masks. This is probably the most well-known example on the list, and it's earned that reputation. When American forces landed in Normandy, nearly every soldier was carrying a gas mask. The fear of chemical warfare was genuine. The Army had taken serious casualties from gas in World War I, and nobody wanted to be caught without protection if the Germans made that choice again. The masks were standard issue, and soldiers were expected to have them. As the campaign continued and weeks passed without a single chemical attack, the thinking started to shift. The masks were heavy, bulky, and taking up space. Every day without an attack was another day's worth of evidence that they probably weren't coming. The masks started disappearing. The bags, though, that is where the story gets interesting. Soldiers figured out almost immediately that the gas mask carrier was a genuinely useful piece of kit on its own. It was well made, had a shoulder strap, and sat in an easy-to-reach position. Men started using them to carry ammunition, rations, grenades, maps, personal items, basically anything they wanted accessible. If you go through wartime photographs from the campaign in Western Europe, you'll see those bags constantly on soldiers who clearly aren't carrying the masks anymore. The mask got ditched. The bag made it to the end of the war. If you were moving through Normandy with no chemical attacks anywhere in sight, would you have kept carrying the mask or found something better to do with that bag? Number 9. The M1938 leggings. Here's where things get a little more complicated, because unlike some items on this list, leggings weren't universally abandoned. I have original wartime photographs showing soldiers in active combat still wearing them. But I also have photographs from the same units, the same operations, where some soldiers have them on and some don't. Occasionally you'll see someone with one legging on and one off, which is its own kind of answer. The M1938 legging was a canvas wrap that ran from the ankle up to just below the knee. The Army's thinking was reasonable. They wanted to protect the foot and lower leg from mud and debris, and to offer a bit of ankle support. The issue was that they were slow to put on, slow to take off, and genuinely uncomfortable during long marches, especially anywhere hot. In North Africa and Italy in particular, soldiers found themselves dealing with canvas soaking up sweat and rubbing their legs raw over miles of rough ground. They got removed whenever the terrain and the officers allowed it. In colder, wetter conditions, the math was different. But in the summer campaigns, a lot of men found ways to quietly lose them. By late 1944, the double-buckle combat boot had started replacing the combination of low-cut shoes and leggings anyway. But that didn't help the men who were already in the hedgerows in June wearing the older setup. If you were already exhausted, moving through difficult terrain, and those leggings were eating through your legs, how long would you have kept them on? Number 8. The full mess kit. This one comes down to simple weight math. Every soldier was issued a complete mess kit, a folding metal tray, a lid that worked as a frying pan, a fork, a knife, and a spoon. It was thoughtfully designed and covered the basics. It made sense for garrison life or a relatively stable field situation. What happened in practice was that soldiers started shedding pieces. The fork went first for a lot of men. If you have a spoon, you can manage most rations just fine. Then the knife. Then for some soldiers in extended combat operations, the whole kit. There are wartime photographs of men eating straight from ration cans or just using their canteen cup and nothing else. None of that is carelessness. When you are spending weeks in a foxhole, when a hot meal is something that happens to other people, when everything on your back represents the distance you still have to cover on foot, even something as small as a folding frying pan stops feeling like a necessity and starts feeling like a choice you do not have to make. Small things get evaluated differently when you are the one carrying them. That is really the thread running through this entire list. Number 7. Shelter half components. Every infantryman carried half a tent. The system was designed so 2 soldiers could combine their halves into a full pup tent at the end of the day, functional, reasonably compact, and simple enough. The catch was that a shelter half on its own isn't a tent. You also needed poles, stakes, and rope, which all had to go somewhere on the soldier's person. During fast-moving operations, and particularly during the breakout from Normandy and the pursuit across France, a lot of those extra components got left behind. Poles vanished first, stakes and rope followed. Some soldiers held onto the canvas itself because even without the poles it had uses, as a ground sheet, as a rain cover, or as something to sleep on top of rather than in the mud. But the full shelter system, the assembled thing it was designed to be, required conditions that the campaign often didn't offer. Moving 10 or 15 miles a day through enemy territory, not knowing where you'd stop or for how long, the idea of carrying tent stakes starts to seem pretty optimistic. Number 6. The D-Day assault jackets. So this is the one I mentioned at the top. For the Normandy landings, many soldiers in the first waves were issued special assault jackets. Purpose-built vests loaded out with extra ammunition, grenades, rations, and other supplies. The reasoning made sense. Pack each man with enough to sustain himself through the initial fighting before resupply could reach him. More gear on the soldier meant a longer window to operate independently after hitting the beach. What the planners had not fully accounted for was what happened when landing craft ramps dropped in water that was deeper than expected. Soldiers stepping off into the channel carrying all that weight found themselves in serious trouble. Some cut equipment away before they reached shore. Some stripped the jackets the moment they had solid ground under them. The jackets had actually been designed with quick-release features built in, because the people who created them understood that soldiers might need to get out of them fast. That detail alone tells you a lot about how they felt about the weight. Some historians have pointed to overloaded gear as a factor in drowning casualties during the landings. The Army designed the jackets to keep soldiers alive longer in the fight. A number of those soldiers decided that getting through the first few minutes alive meant getting rid of them first. Let's start with something most people have never heard of, which is actually kind of the point. The gas mask brassard was a small, chemically treated armband that soldiers wore on their sleeve. The idea was that if the Germans released chemical agents, the armband would visibly react and give soldiers an early warning. No moving parts, nothing to switch on, just a passive detection system built into something you were already wearing. On paper, that is actually a smart concept. The problem was that the same chemical sensitivity that made it useful also made it fragile. Sweat broke it down, rain broke it down. The general roughness of moving through a combat zone broke it down. Pull up photographs from the Normandy landings and you can see brassards on soldiers' arms. Look at photographs taken just a day or two later and they have practically vanished. Not because soldiers chose to remove them, but because in many cases the armbands had already come apart on their own. There is a photograph of Private First Class Morris Lee Thomas from H Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, taken just hours after the invasion. His brassard is already visibly falling apart. He had not even had it on for a full day. Thomas was later killed in action on October 6, 1944. Here is the other part of that story. Germany never used chemical weapons on the Western Front. Not once. So, the brassards deteriorated before soldiers could even decide whether to keep them, in preparation for a threat that never materialized. That is a rough legacy for any piece of military kit. But it sets up everything else on this list pretty well. Number 4. Bayonet scabbards. This one tends to surprise people because it is not really about soldiers abandoning bayonets. Many of them did not. The bayonet was still useful and in certain situations essential. What changed was the configuration. Soldiers in combat constantly rearranged how and where they carried things, regardless of what the issued setup looked like. Bayonets got moved to belts, repositioned for faster access, or carried in ways that made more sense for the individual soldier's job and situation. The scabbard that came with them sometimes got ditched in favor of something improvised. It is a less dramatic story than some of the others here, but it points to something consistent across all 10 entries. The Army issued a system. The field taught soldiers whether that system worked, and when it did not, they changed it. Usually quietly, and often without anyone's official approval. Number 3. Older T-handle entrenching tools. This one is a bit different, because the soldiers who moved on from the older T-handle shovel were not doing it because the tool was useless. They were doing it because something better showed up. The T-handle had been around for a while. It worked, but it was bulky, awkward to carry over long distances, and not exactly what you would call comfortable to have on your kit for hours at a stretch. When the M1943 folding entrenching tool started reaching troops in the field, smaller, more compact, and easier to attach to the rest of their gear, the older version started disappearing fast. That is worth holding on to as a principle. Not everything soldiers abandoned had failed them. Sometimes they just found something that did the job better and lighter. The M1943 became one of the more popular pieces of kit issued in the latter stages of the war, and the older design's reputation did not survive the comparison. Number 2. The M1928 Haversack. Before anyone heads to the comments, soldiers absolutely carried the M1928 Haversack throughout the war. I have plenty of photographs that show it. But there's a distinction the men who actually used it understood very clearly, and it's the key to this whole entry. The difference between a marching load and a combat load. As a marching pack, the haversack did its job. Blankets, shelter halves, extra clothing, mess gear, personal items, it held everything a soldier needed to live in the field. And you genuinely needed all of it. No argument there. The problem came when the fighting started. Moving through hedgerows, clearing buildings, pushing through rubble-filled streets, a full pack on your back becomes something that catches on every obstacle, throws off your movement, and adds weight at exactly the moment you most need to be quick and low. It wasn't designed for that, and soldiers knew it, so they left them behind. Usually at rally points or assembly areas before going into action, fully intending to come back for them later. Sometimes they did. Sometimes the situation changed and the pack stayed where it was. Look through photographs of American infantry in active firefights and the haversacks are largely absent. Not because the men didn't have them, but because before the shooting started, they had made a decision about what they actually needed in the next few hours, and stripped everything else. The Army issued it for living in the field. Combat taught soldiers which parts of living in the field were going to keep them breathing. Number 1. The Bayar bipod. This is almost certainly the most consistently discarded piece of equipment in the entire war. Some people today aren't even convinced they were issued at all, but they were. Finding one in a wartime combat photograph, though, is genuinely difficult. The Browning automatic rifle was the squad's automatic weapon. It was also one of the heaviest individual weapons any American rifleman carried, somewhere around 19 pounds unloaded, before ammunition. The bar gunner was already dealing with one of the most demanding physical loads in the squad. He was a critical asset, and he knew it. He was also carrying something that made every march an exercise in endurance. Then the Army added a bipod to the front of it. The intention was reasonable. It was to stabilize the weapon for sustained fire and improve accuracy in fixed positions. For a squad-level automatic weapon, that's a legitimate tactical concept. Bar gunners had a different view. The bipod made an already front-heavy weapon harder to carry and slower to move with. And the kind of fighting most of them actually did, advancing, repositioning, flanking, reacting quickly to a changing situation, had very little use for a device designed for static fire positions. It added weight and took up space and didn't give much back in return, so they came off, across every theater, across most units, at a rate that's striking when you look at the photographic record. There's a well-known image from Pointe du Hoc on D-Day that shows a ranger carrying a bar with a bipod still on it. And the reason that photograph gets attention is precisely because the bipod is visible. It's the exception. If you were already hauling the heaviest weapon in the squad, would you keep the bipod, or use that extra weight to carry more ammunition? Bar gunners worked that out pretty fast, and most of them came to the same answer. During World War II, American soldiers were not just trying to make things easier on themselves. They were trying to survive. Survival turned out to require a very different accounting than the one done back at the planning level. Every item on this list was issued for a reason. The Army thought carefully about what soldiers would need, anticipated problems, and tried to prepare men for every situation they might face. The intentions were genuine. The effort was real. But what the Army issued was designed for every possible situation. What soldiers actually needed was what worked in the specific situation they were in, that week, that operation, that stretch of road. And the gap between those two things is what this whole list is really about. Gas masks, leggings, mess kits, haversacks, BAR bipods. Each one is a different version of the same story. Soldiers looked at what they were carrying, looked at what was ahead of them, and decided what was actually going to help. Ounces equal pounds, pounds equal pain. Generations of soldiers have had to learn that lesson the hard way, on their feet, in the field. Out of all 10, which one would you have dropped first? If there are other items from the war you would like to see covered, there are plenty more. Let me know below.